The air at 30,000 feet is a predatory thing. It does not merely chill. It bites through wool and leather, seeking out the moisture in a man's breath to turn it into a mask of ice. Inside the plexiglass bubble of a flying fortress, the waist gunner is suspended in a sub-zero stratosphere. His world is reduced to the vibration of 4 Wright cyclone engines and the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of his own heart. His hands, encased in bulky heated gloves, grip the spade handles of a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. Outside, the sky is a bruised purple, streaked with the white scars of contrails and the black, oily blossoms of flak. Suddenly, the scream of a Focke Wulf 190 tears through the thin air. A silver flash dives through the formation, with cannons blazing. The gunner squeezes the trigger. In that heartbeat, the entire American industrial experiment is compressed into a few inches of steel. The bolt cycles with a violent mechanical perfection, slamming forward and back 800 times a minute. At 50 degrees below zero, oil should be a sludge, and metal should be brittle enough to shatter like glass. Yet the weapon sings. It is a masterpiece of precision metalworking. It is a device where a deviation of 1/1000th of an inch in a factory back in Ohio would mean a jammed feeder, a melted barrel, and a dead crew. This is the pinnacle of the gunmaker's art. It is a lethal synchronized dance of parts forged in the sooty mysteries of Midwestern furnaces, performing flawlessly in an environment that defies human life. But the roar of the Browning and the scream of the Luftwaffe fade. The sounds are replaced by a silence so heavy it feels like dust. But to understand this mechanical triumph, we must look back to a time of stagnation and decay. The freezing wind of the Atlantic gives way to the stagnant, humid air of a United States Army warehouse in the spring of 1940. Here, there are no precision-tooled marvels. There is only the smell of rotting leather, stale cosmoline, and the quiet decay of a hollow military. In this dim light, the reality of American readiness is exposed as a dangerous illusion. An officer walks past rows of relics from the Great War. He sees French 75mm guns mounted on wooden wheels with steel tires. These are the horse and buggy remnants of a bygone era. These are weapons that would literally shatter if towed behind a modern truck at 30 miles per hour. The inventory is a ledger of despair. While the German Blitzkrieg is currently shattering the Low Countries with 3,000 modern tanks, the United States possesses exactly 0 modern 105mm howitzers. The nation's armored strength is a pathetic collection of roughly 400 light tanks. They are little more than thin-skinned boxes on tracks. The Norway scare and the sudden terrifying collapse of France act like a physical blow to the American psyche. In the halls of Congress, the rat hole sessions begin. These are tense, desperate hearings where the devastating truth is laid bare. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge gazes at the nation's total tank inventory and realizes with a jolt of terror that the United States is effectively naked. On training grounds, soldiers are practicing maneuvers with broomsticks for rifles and stovepipes for cannons. This is a popgun army playing at war while the world burns. The transition from this skeletal country club force into a global industrial juggernaut would not be a miracle of spontaneous combustion. It was the beginning of a grueling psychological struggle against the haunting spectre of time. Behind the scenes in the cramped, stifling rooms of the munitions building, the Ordnance Department was already beginning to stir. For 20 years, men like Brigadier General Charles T. Harris, Jr. had been engaged in the thankless work of paper planning. They were drafting blueprints for plants that did not exist and soliciting educational orders from a public that viewed them as merchants of death. They knew what the politicians did not. They knew that a powder plant or a tank factory has an inexorable gestation period that no amount of gold can compress. The coming victory would be forged not in the first frantic months of procurement, but in the quiet intellectual foundation laid during 2 decades of neglect. It would prove that while the battlefield is a place of thunder, it is sustained only by the humdrum, bureaucratic necessity of the lamp of experience. By June 1940, the haunting spectre of time had stopped whispering. It was screaming. The fall of Paris was not just a headline. It was a physical weight pressing down on the humid, unair-conditioned offices of the munitions building in Washington. Planners who had spent 20 years in a country club atmosphere of theoretical blueprints were suddenly thrust into a frantic, 24-hour reality. The Norway scare had evaporated, replaced by the cold realization that the British were retreating from Dunkirk and the United States was effectively disarmed. Into this atmosphere of stifling heat and panicked memos walked William S. Knudsen. He was a giant of a man with a thick Danish accent, and the soot of Detroit's assembly lines practically etched into his skin. The former president of General Motors represented the collision of the boardroom and the battlefield. On a sweltering afternoon, Knudsen sat across from the military's top brass. His large hands rested on a table cluttered with abstract mobilization plans and vague strategic summaries. He did not want to hear about force projections or strategic theater requirements. He leaned forward, the smell of expensive tobacco clinging to his suit, and cut through the bureaucratic fog with a single sharp demand. I want to know what kind of equipment you need. I want to know how many pieces of each kind. The silence that followed was the sound of a century-old system breaking. The army had been thinking in terms of budgets and expenditure programs. Knudsen was thinking in terms of steel, rubber, and man-hours. He forced the generals to move from the abstract to the itemized. He told them to stop asking for modernization and start asking for 18,900 anti-tank guns and 55,000 anti-aircraft guns. This was the birth of the munitions program of June 30th, 1940. In a single stroke of a pen, the financial floodgates burst open. The government authorized a staggering $348,228,998 for expansion. It was the moment the guns and butter philosophy died. It was replaced by a singular obsessive focus on the must program. But money was only paper. The true struggle was physical, to bridge the gap between the government's aging arsenals and the nation's untapped industrial power. The Ordnance Department turned to a radical, controversial model. This was the government-owned, contractor-operated plant. This was the agent-operator revolution. Its implementation felt less like a strategic shift and more like a fever dream. Imagine a boardroom in Cincinnati or Chicago. The air smells of roasted grain or the floral scent of industrial soap. Executives from companies like Quaker Oats, Procter & Gamble, and Sherwin-Williams sat in stunned silence. These were men whose lives were dedicated to breakfast cereals, ivory soap, and house paint. Now army officers unrolled massive, complex blueprints before them. These were not designs for cereal boxes or shipping crates. These were the intricate lethal schematics for high-explosive loading lines and TNT nitration vats. The transition had begun, but the road to the stratosphere would be paved with industrial friction. The tension in those boardrooms was something you could feel in your teeth. A soap executive might trace his finger over the cold steel specifications for a 105mm shell. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that his company was being asked to manage a facility where a single spark could level an entire zip code. The merchants of death stigma from the 1930s still hung in the air like a foul mist. It made these partnerships feel like a dangerous pact. Critics in Congress called these government-owned plants monstrously wasteful. They pointed to the massive complexes being carved out of the Missouri scrub at Weldon Spring or the Mississippi wilderness at Flora. But the military did not budge. They did not need gunsmiths or artisans. They needed managers who understood high-speed, high-precision logistics. By August of 1940, the weight of the effort was crushing the Central Command in Washington. The administrative joints of the munitions building were creaking under the strain of 400 prime contracts and 8,000 industrial facilities. On August 16, 1940, the order was given to decentralize the burden. The district system was activated. The pulse of the war effort shifted away from the Potomac and into the regional hubs of Pittsburgh, Chicago, Birmingham, and Hartford. The power moved to the understaffed district offices. These men were the front line of the regular army of production. They were the ones who had to look a small-town contractor in the eye and explain why a 1918-era lathe was not good enough for a 90mm carriage. They battled the Aleutian stare of exhausted engineers who had been staring at contracts for 18 hours straight. By the end of August, the country club cadence of peacetime business was dead. It was replaced by the roar of the forge and the frantic, rhythmic tapping of IBM tabulating machines. The nation had begun a desperate terminal race to build an arsenal that could sustain the world. By the autumn of 1940, the American military was trapped in a requirement paradox. The mood in the munitions building swung violently between bullish optimism and bearish panic with every morning radio bulletin. One day, the industrial machine seemed to be waking up. The next, the news of a fresh U-boat success sent planners into a cold sweat. This was a mathematical struggle to balance speed against control. Planners were haunted by a single terrifying question. Would the weapon they were building today be a relic by the time the factory was finished? This tension reached a fever pitch over a 9-pound piece of wood and steel called the M1 Garand. In late 1940, the Garand was not yet a legend. It was a political lightning rod. In the smoke-filled rooms of Washington and the editorial pages of the national press, a toxic controversy raged. Critics branded the rifle a failure. They whispered of teething problems and gas port clogs. The atmosphere was so poisoned that at the Camp Perry rifle matches, Army personnel had to use sleight of hand to hide malfunctions from the press. They were terrified that a single jam would give the politicians the ammunition they needed to kill the program. The climax of this drama unfolded in the biting chill of the 1940 Marine Corps tests. Picture a muddy, wind-swept firing range where the air smells of wet wool and burnt gunpowder. Marine officers stood with clipboards, their faces set in grim masks of skepticism. Across from them was the Garand. This was a semi-automatic beast that promised to give every American private the firepower of a small squad. The test was a brutal, unromantic marathon. Soldiers crawled through freezing muck and dragged the rifles through sand and water. They rose to fire as fast as they could pull the trigger. The metallic ping of the empty clip, ejecting into the dirt, became the heartbeat of the trial. John C. Garand watched from the sidelines. He was a man who lived on a modest salary and refused to take a penny in royalties for his invention. The stakes were absolute. If the rifle failed here, the American infantry would enter the war outgunned. But as the thousands of rounds tore through the targets, the Garand did not just survive, it dominated. The rugged, mechanical soul of the weapon proved it could endure the hell of the front line. The political fireworks were finally silenced, yet as the infantry found its rifle, the nation's air defense was collapsing into a different kind of crisis. The domestic 37mm gun was exposed as a popgun. It was incapable of swatting modern Luftwaffe dive bombers from the sky. In early 1941, the Ordnance Department abandoned decades of domestic development to adopt a Swedish design. This was the 40mm Bofors. The Americanization of this weapon was a cinematic struggle of engineering. At the Firestone plant, the air was thick with the smell of drafting ink. Engineers stared in disbelief at the Swedish blueprints. The measurements were in metric. The tolerances were designed for the slow, artisanal pace of European workshops. Firestone did not have weeks to hand-file a single part. They had minutes. Engineers labored to convert thousands of metric specifications into imperial inches while the world was on fire. They looked at the 1,000 rivets required for the carriage and realized it would take an eternity to assemble. In a bold act of industrial rebellion, they threw out the rivets and replaced them with high-speed welding. They swapped expensive bronze for mass-production bushings. This was a violent redesign of a masterpiece to fit the precision of an Ohio assembly line. But even as the blueprints were finalized, the entire Allied supply chain hit a brick wall. This was the machine tool bottleneck. By March of 1941, General Wesson issued a chilling memo titled Probable Failure of Ordnance Program. The warning was stark. You can have the money, the men, and the designs, but without the high-precision lathes and grinders to cut the steel. The arsenal of democracy was a ghost. The search for these tools became a scavenger hunt of national proportions. Unpaid civilian distributors toured the country like industrial detectives. They walked through the Rust Belt graveyards of the Civil War era. They searched for idle equipment in the back of locomotive foundries and printing press shops. They were looking for the massive piercing presses and the 1,000-ton hydraulic monsters needed to forge a heavy gun tube. The atmosphere in these factories was one of 11th-hour desperation. Managers worked under the Aleutian stare of exhaustion. Their eyes were red from poring over priority ratings that shifted like the wind. Every critical boring machine allocated to a tank plant was a tool stripped from an aircraft factory. This was a zero-sum game, played with the lives of soldiers. By the summer of 1941, the United States was no longer a country club military, but it was not yet a juggernaut. It was a nation in the grip of a long and tragic delay. The country was waiting for the machines that would finally allow the gunmaker's art to meet the terrifying scale of global war. Then came the shock of Pearl Harbor. It did not merely break the peace. It shattered the requirement paradox that had paralyzed Washington for years. The long and tragic delay was over. It was replaced by a directive from the president that felt like a physical blow to industrial planners. He demanded 55,000 anti-aircraft guns and nearly 19,000 anti-tank guns. These were to be delivered with a speed that defied the laws of physics. The industry ordnance team was no longer a slogan. It was a desperate, cross-woven fabric of American life. Competitors like Eastman Kodak and National Cash Register were forced into high-tension boardroom showdowns. They were ordered to surrender their trade secrets and share blueprints to save the ammunition program from collapse. Yet beneath the soaring rhetoric of the arsenal of democracy, the entire war effort was vibrating on a knife's edge. The mission was threatened by a catastrophic shortage of the one thing a modern army cannot live without: high explosives. In the autumn of 1941, the American powder program was a house of cards. Planners were haunted by the memory of the Great War. They remembered how the snail's pace of chemical production had left guns silent at the front. The bottleneck was TNT nitration. This was a slow, volatile, and artisanal process that seemed impossible to scale. Into this crisis stepped Lieutenant Colonel John P. Harris. Imagine Harris in a sprawling grey chemical plant in Canada. His breath hitched in the frigid, metallic air. The atmosphere inside the facility was thick with the acrid, choking scent of toluene and the sharp, biting sting of nitric acid. Harris was a man who lived and breathed the mysteries of the gunmaker's art. He stood on a steel catwalk and watched the bubbling vats with a practiced, skeptical eye. He stopped the clock. He noticed something that defied every safety manual in the American arsenal. The Canadian engineers were doing it backward. Instead of the traditional, cautious American method, they were introducing toluene directly into the acid. To an ordnance officer trained in the country club era of safety first, it looked like a recipe for a massive crater-forming explosion. But as Harris watched the gauges, his heart hammered against his ribs. He realized he was witnessing a miracle of chemistry. By reversing the nitration, they were not just making TNT, they were tripling the output. Harris did not wait for a committee. He raced back across the border. Within months, the reverse nitration discovery was being hammered into the foundations of the Baytown Ordnance Works. The cost of a pound of TNT plummeted from 12 cents to 6. Daily production surged from 33,000 pounds to over 100,000. The fist of the fighting forces finally had its knuckles, but by 1943, the adrenaline of the initial surge had curdled into a dangerous, premature optimism. In the air-conditioned conference rooms of Washington, a country club atmosphere returned. Planners looked at the maps of North Africa and the Russian advance. They convinced themselves the war was nearly won. They began to dismantle the very juggernaut they had bled to build. Labor was laid off. Production lines were scrapped. Factories were placed in cold storage. This was the era of the logjam. It was a failure of high-level imagination. Planners assumed the future of combat would be a mobile, lightning-fast affair. They believed air power could replace the heavy, unglamorous roar of artillery. The bill for this arrogance was presented in the winter of 1944. It arrived in the knee-deep, freezing mud of the Italian campaign. Stop the clock here, in the shadow of the jagged grey peaks of the Apennines. The air does not just smell of cordite. It smells of wet earth, rotting mules, and the cold, metallic sweat of men who know they are outgunned. An American artillery officer crouches in a slit trench. His hands shake as he grips a pair of Type EE binoculars. Through the lenses, the world looks like it has been submerged in 2 dirty milk bottles. The civilian-grade optics are fogging and useless in the humid mountain air. He watches as a German 170mm gun rains fire on his position with impunity. The weapon is hidden deep in a limestone cave. His own 75mm and 105mm howitzers are barking back, but their shells are bouncing off the fortified German winter line like hailstones on a tin roof. The myth of air power has vanished. The heavy bombers are grounded by the low, leaden clouds. The infantry is left to die in the slush. The officer screams into a field telephone. He begs for the long toms. He needs the heavy 155mm and 240mm guns. These were the weapons the planners back home had deprioritized as too slow for modern war. The desperation was visceral. While officials back in the States were testifying about production surpluses, commanders in Italy were rationing shells as if they were gold. The bloody lesson was being learned in real time. You cannot convince a fortified ridge to surrender with anything less than 1,000 pounds of high explosives. This disconnect triggered a frantic, near-desperate blitz expansion in late 1944. In a single cinematic room in Washington, General Campbell gathered the titans of industry. He met with the Bureau of the Budget and authorized a $300 million rebirth of the artillery program in a single afternoon. Shuttered plants like Weldon Spring were shocked back to life. Labor caravans toured the country to find the thousands of machinists needed to feed the white heat of the furnaces once more. The roar of the forge returned, but it was a frantic, 11th-hour race against time. It proved that in the theater of total war, the feast of production is only as good as the experience of the man in the mud. Now, we return to that frozen sky over Europe. By 1944, the stratosphere had not grown any warmer. The B-17 waist gunner still felt the predatory bite of the wind through his flight suit. But as a Focke-Wulf 190 dove again, the stakes of the industrial gamble reached their final, violent resolution. The gunner's life hung on the reliability of the Browning 50 caliber machine gun. This was a weapon forged in the sooty mysteries of an Ohio furnace. He squeezed the spade handles, and the weapon sang. There was no jam, there was no brittle snap of metal, there was no sluggish hesitation of frozen oil. This was the ultimate validation of the district system. Somewhere in a Midwestern factory months earlier, a worker had checked a tolerance to 1/1000th of an inch. Because of the obsessive standardization of the industry ordnance team, that part functioned perfectly in a sub-zero hell. The gunner's tracers tore into the German wing route. The interceptor spiraled away in a plume of black smoke. The qualitative advantage was no longer a theory on a blueprint. It was the reason the gunner would live to see the sunrise. This victory was not a miracle. It was bought by the lead time established years before the first shot was fired. The United States achieved victory by expending steel and high explosives instead of just lives. This massive effort forever shifted the industrial heart of the nation. The sooty mysteries of the factory floor had been solved, and in the end, the arsenal of democracy had proven itself to be the ultimate weapon of war. As the air war reached its crescendo, the ground war in Europe devolved into a brutal, static slog. This was a war of attrition that the planners in Washington never intended to fight. By the winter of 1944, the easy optimism of the previous year was exposed as a catastrophic error. Planners had prematurely dismantled the heavy artillery lines, believing the war was nearly won. Now, the log jam in Italy and the concrete walls of the Siegfried Line demanded a massive, desperate pivot. The military called it the 1944 Blitz expansion. In the office of the Chief of Ordnance, the atmosphere turned frantic once again. General Campbell gathered the titans of the War Production Board and the Bureau of the Budget into a single room. There was no time for the crawling pace of bureaucratic review. In one afternoon, they authorized a $300 million rebirth of the heavy ammunition program. That figure would eventually surge towards $700 million. The industrial landscape responded with a roar that eclipsed even the early days of 1942. Shuttered plants like Gopher and Weldon Springs were shocked back to life. Their floodlights burned through the night as 1,000 heavy-duty lathes and 19 massive piercing presses were hammered into place. The American workforce shifted yet again. In the powder plants, women now made up over 34% of the labor force. By March of 1945, thousands of enlisted men were furloughed from the front lines back to the factory floors. Their hands traded the cold steel of a rifle for the greasy wrenches of a machinist. They worked through unusually heavy snowstorms that buried the loading plants. Their eyes were red with the exhaustion of the long haul, driven by the knowledge that the infantry in the mud of the Ardennes was counting shells one by one. This was the hailstorm of the American doctrine, the substitution of steel for blood. At Cassino, the American guns expended 11,000 tons of shells in a single attack. At Iwo Jima, 40,000 tons of explosives rained down upon a mere 8 square miles. The agent-operator model had reached its terrifying peak. Firms like Procter & Gamble and Quaker Oats managed a logistical symphony. A single 105mm shell traveled 10,000 miles through 12 different plants before final assembly. The result was a psychological devastation that no amount of bravery could counter. A captured German medical officer looked at the pulverized remains of his position and summarized the industrial tragedy of his own nation. He lamented that the Americans expended artillery ammunition, while his own country expended only the bodies of men. The end of the struggle did not come with a bang, but with a sudden, jarring silence. On August 14, 1945, the frantic hum of the industrial engine was cut short. A wave of telegrams went out to every plant in the nation. Stop production. Cancel all contracts. The white heat of the furnaces began to cool. The acrid smell of explosives and oil began to dissipate from the Mississippi Valley and the American Southwest. These were regions whose economic DNA had been permanently rewritten by the war. The legacy of this effort remains a sobering lesson in the reality of lead time. The American victory was not a miracle of spontaneous combustion following the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was the hard-won fruit of 2 decades of quiet, professional preparation. For 20 years, these men had been ignored by a complacent public. The war was won because of the 18-month rule. It was won because the blueprints, the educational orders, and the district system had been established years before the first shot was fired. The United States had entered the conflict with a hollow force of broomstick rifles and wooden-wheeled guns. It finished as a global juggernaut because it had mastered the humdrum, bureaucratic necessity of logistics. Ultimately, the sooty mysteries of the forge proved a fundamental truth. While hell is out of bounds, it is managed through the lamp of experience. This preparation ensured that when the gunner squeezed the trigger in the freezing sky, the machine did not fail him. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.